The book of the Bible which I've chosen as being memorable for me is the Old Testament book of Jonah, one of God's prophets. One of my early memories is of my child's first Bible story book, which had a beautiful illustration of Jonah sitting bolt upright inside a fish. This intrigued me when I compared the size of the fish I knew to my rather tall father. How could Jonah fit so easily into a fish? A visit to the museum in Edinburgh with my grandparents subsequently enlightened me that any one of a number of species which inhabited the ocean was capable of accommodating a man. But how did Jonah get into this predicament? At the beginning of the book, God commanded his prophet to go to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Jonah was a Hebrew, and the Assyrians were the enemies of his people. So what did he do? Did he obey God as we would expect? Well, no, he didn't. He got onto a boat which he hoped would take him as far away from Nineveh as possible. His disobedience of God's command led him into great trouble. There were consequences. Once aboard the boat, he fell into a deep sleep, but a very powerful storm arose and threatened to sink the vessel. The sailors came to understand that this was no ordinary storm, and that somebody aboard the boat had done something to anger their God. If it wasn't them, then it had to be Jonah, and indeed Jonah had already told them that he was fleeing from his God. The sailors were reluctant to abandon Jonah, but the storm grew increasingly worse. Eventually, Jonah ordered them to throw him overboard because they were suffering from his disobedience. Immediately, Jonah was thrown overboard. The storm ceased. The pagan sailors were so overwhelmed by their experience that they prayed to God. But what of Jonah? Well, he sank down through the levels of the ocean, and he would have been drowned but for God's great mercy. He found sanctuary in the stomach of a fish, and for 3 days and nights he turned to God in prayer and thanks, and eventually found himself back on dry land. God again commanded him to go to Nineveh, and this time he obeyed. When he told the people of Nineveh that their city was going to be destroyed because of their wickedness, the king and all the people believed him and repented, and God, in his compassion, spared them from the threatened destruction of their city. Jonah, though he had already benefited from God's mercy, was not happy. He had not wanted to go to Nineveh in the first place, to tell them of God's plan for the destruction of their city, because he knew God to be a merciful God who would not carry out his threat of destruction of the city if the people repented. The Assyrians were his enemies, so he had no personal interest in seeing them saved. And in fact, he feared that he would look foolish if he prophesied the destruction of the city and it didn't then happen. Finally, Jonah went outside the city and found a place to shelter, wait to see what happened. God provided a plant for further shelter, but then he sent a worm to destroy the plant. While Jonah might be sorry to lose the plant, God would also be sorry to lose the Assyrians. The message is that God's great mercy is available not just for Jonah, not just for the pagan sailors or for the pagan Assyrians, but by extension for all people, as God wants to save mankind. Jonah attempted to flee God, but he came to his senses after he had been saved by God's mercy and he got another chance. Those who have received God's mercy, like Jonah, cannot seek to prevent that mercy from reaching others who have repented, even if they are enemies.